Welcome back to History for Sleep, where the past whispers softly through time, and we turn the chaos of history into calm, steady storytelling to help you drift into rest. Tonight, we journey into a world where passion was a sin, yet desire was everywhere. Where priests preached purity by day, but the night held secrets of its own. This is lust, love, and sin in medieval times. A quiet descent into the tangled web of morality, temptation, and the forbiddens under the watchful eyes of the church. Imagine candlelight flickering in cold stone halls, where whispered confessions revealed desires that no sermon could erase. Behind monastery walls, beneath royal sheets, in peasant fields and city brothels, lust lived on. It was denied, punished, and hidden, yet it thrived in the shadows of faith and fear. Tonight, we'll explore the secret language of love, the strange laws of purity, and the lives of people caught between body and soul. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Let the world fade, let your mind quiet. If you enjoy these late-night journeys through history, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new story. Comment below and tell us what time you listen. Are you a midnight wanderer or someone who drifts off just after dusk? And let us know what historical mysteries you'd like to hear next. Now, close your eyes if you'd like, breathe slowly, and imagine yourself in a world where every glance could be a sin, every touch a confession, and every desire a test of the soul. This is the medieval world of lust and sin, where humanity's oldest temptations met its most unyielding rules. Let's begin. In the quiet shadows of medieval cathedrals, under the towering arches that reached toward heaven, there existed an invisible battle. It wasn't fought with swords or shields, but with words, guilt, and fear. It was the Church's long and relentless war on human desire. From the pulpit, priests warned that lust was not only a sin, but the root of countless evils. It was the whisper of the devil, the fall of Eve, the reason paradise was lost. And yet, behind the stone walls of faith, the people they preached to were still human, longing, wanting, and dreaming in ways they could never confess aloud. The medieval church sought to control nearly every aspect of human life, from the food people ate to the way they loved. It declared that the flesh was weak and that purity was strength. Sermons thundered against fornication, lust, and even the smallest hint of pleasure. To the church, desire was dangerous because it reminded people of their bodies, and the body was seen as a trap for the soul. In monasteries and villages alike, people were taught that the path to heaven lay through denial, to resist the temptations of the body and obey the laws of the spirit. But desire, as history has shown, rarely obeys anyone. In those days, the act of love itself was heavily monitored. There were certain days when even married couples were forbidden from being intimate, days of fasting, days of holy celebration, and nearly half the calendar. To the faithful, lust was not only an indulgence, but a rebellion against divine order. Priests described it as a fire that burned away virtue, a sickness that could spread from one soul to another. Confessionals filled with murmured regrets and trembling admissions of passion, each one met with stern instructions to repent and abstain. The more the church fought against lust, the more powerful it seemed to become. Behind this moral crusade, however, there was also a kind of fascination. Medieval theology often dwelled on lust with surprising detail, describing temptations vividly, almost as though the preachers themselves could not look away. The writings of scholars and monks are filled with contradictions, warnings about sin written in language so rich and descriptive that they betrayed hidden curiosity. Some of the same men who condemned desire also studied it, trying to understand how something so natural could be so dangerous. It was a moral puzzle that even they could not solve. For the ordinary people of the Middle Ages, the Church's teachings created an uneasy relationship with their own bodies. To feel desire was to feel guilt, and guilt became as constant as breathing. A farmer might look at his wife with longing and then feel shame. A young woman might feel affection and wonder if it meant she was unholy. The body became an enemy to be subdued, a vessel that carried sin. This fear shaped medieval culture in profound ways, in its art, its laws, and even its love stories. Yet despite the sermons and the punishments, desire never disappeared. It hid in poetry and song, in stolen glances and secret letters. Troubadours sang of courtly love, pure spiritual affection that conveniently disguised more earthly emotions. Behind the facade of holiness, people continued to love and lust, though always in secret. The church could demand confession, impose penance, and threaten damnation, but it could never fully control the heart. Every whisper of temptation, every hidden smile, was a quiet act of rebellion against the rule of purity. In time, this war on desire would shape not only personal lives, but entire societies. Marriage laws, gender roles, and even medicine were influenced by the church's obsession with controlling the flesh. The human body was seen as a battlefield between sin and salvation, and no one could truly escape that struggle. But as centuries passed, cracks began to form in this wall of fear. The very people who were told to repress their desires began to question why they were punished for being human. And though the church tried to define what was holy and what was sinful, lust continued to thrive in the dark corners of medieval life, quiet, persistent, and unrepentant. This was not just a war on lust. It was a war on human nature itself, fought with guilt instead of weapons, and with souls instead of soldiers. And like all wars of the spirit, it would leave deep marks on the people who lived through it, shaping the way they saw love, sin, and themselves for centuries to come. If the church's war on desire was a battle for souls, then the idea of the forbidden flesh was its battlefield. In the Middle Ages, sin was not only an invisible burden, but something that lived in the very body. The flesh was believed to tempt, to whisper, to lead one astray. Every impulse, every craving was suspect. To feel pleasure was to risk eternal punishment, and to act upon it was to invite shame and condemnation. Yet, in every corner of medieval society, people continued to struggle against the tension between what they were told to resist and what they could not help but feel. Rules about the body were everywhere. There were instructions for how one should sleep, what one should wear, and even when it was acceptable to bathe. Cleanliness itself was sometimes seen as vanity, a temptation toward pride or sensuality. The human form, especially the unclothed body, was a subject of fear and fascination. Artists were discouraged from depicting it. Writers cloaked it in allegory. And yet, despite all efforts to suppress it, the flesh was impossible to ignore. It aged, it ached, it desired. And desire, once born, was hard to silence. The church prescribed strict codes for what was allowed within marriage. Love between husband and wife was not forbidden, but pleasure was rarely discussed as something good. It was tolerated only when tied to duty, the duty to reproduce, to create more faithful souls for God. Outside of this narrow purpose, pleasure was often seen as corruption. To seek it for its own sake was to stray into dangerous territory. The act itself was carefully monitored. Manuals written for confessors listed the sins of the flesh in painstaking detail, describing positions, times, and intentions that could turn something lawful into something sinful. The forbiddance was outlined so thoroughly that it almost invited curiosity. For those caught breaking these moral rules, punishment could be both public and humiliating. Adulterers might be paraded through town, half-dressed, to face the jeers of neighbors. Fornication, intimacy before marriage, was a common offense, and fines or penance were imposed to cleanse the soul. But behind closed doors, these same moralists often faltered. Priests fathered children in secret. Nobles maintained mistresses despite their oaths. Monks whispered prayers by day and succumbed to temptation by night. The flesh, no matter how condemned, refused to obey the law of purity. There was also the question of who bore the blame. Women, especially, were seen as the embodiment of temptation. Their beauty was considered both a gift and a curse, a dangerous power that could lead men to ruin. The story of Eve hung heavily over every generation, reminding them that the fall of mankind began with a woman's desire. Thus, modesty became a form of control. Women were taught to cover, to hide, to avoid attention. If a man fell to temptation, it was often said to be her fault for being too alluring, too alive. The forbidden's flesh was not just a sin. It was a weapon used to justify inequality. In this climate of fear and repression, the human body became both sacred and shameful. To touch it was to risk impurity. To show it was to invite judgment. But at the same time, it was the source of life, the vessel of creation. These contradictions defined medieval thought. The very thing that made people human, their capacity for feeling, for connection, was the thing they were told to deny. And so, many lived quietly in conflict, torn between their faith and their nature. Over time, the idea of the forbidden's flesh took on deeper meaning. It wasn't only about lust or sin. It was about control, who had the right to define what was holy and what was unholy. The Church's authority extended far beyond the chapel walls. It reached into the most private parts of life, deciding when and how people could love, touch, and even think about their bodies. To disobey was to risk more than social disgrace. It was to challenge the entire order of the world. And yet, beneath this web of rules and fear, the forbidden's flesh still found a way to speak. It whispered in poetry, in secret romances, in small acts of defiance. Every forbidden's touch, every hidden kiss, became a quiet rebellion against centuries of control. It was proof that no decree, no sermon, could erase the most basic truth of humanity, that to be alive was to desire, and to desire was to be human. And for the people of the Middle Ages, that truth was both their greatest sin and their deepest comfort. The confessional was one of the strangest and most intimate spaces of the medieval world. A place of silence and whispers, it stood between heaven and hell, sin and forgiveness. Within its dark wooden walls, people poured out their most private thoughts to a priest who acted as both judge and redeemer. Here, desire was catalogued, categorized, and cleansed, or at least, that was the hope. For centuries, the confessional became the Church's window into the hidden life of the human heart, and nowhere was this more revealing than in the sins of the flesh. Imagine a small stone church lit only by candles. The air smells of wax and dust. Outside, the world carries on, markets, laughter, rain. But inside, a man kneels, trembling. His voice is low as he confesses what he has done, or perhaps what he has thought. Maybe it was a stolen moment with a woman not his wife, or a glance too long at another man's beauty, or a dream he cannot forget. Whatever it is, it feels heavy, dangerous, forbidden. On the other side of the screen, the priest listens, guiding, questioning, sometimes probing for details that make the sinner's face burn with shame. Confession was both a mercy and a tool of control. It allowed people to unburden themselves, to seek forgiveness, but it also gave the Church extraordinary power. Every secret desire, every private act was recorded in memory or written in the manuals that guided priests. These guides described the questions a confessor should ask. How often? With whom? Did you feel pleasure? Did you consent? The level of detail was astonishing, and it revealed a paradox. The Church condemned lust, but could not stop talking about it. In trying to root it out, it studied it with almost obsessive fascination. For the faithful, the experience could be both humiliating and comforting. To speak one's shame aloud was to confront it, but it also meant surrendering privacy. Many feared their secrets might travel beyond the booth, whispered in taverns, or used to judge them later. Yet others found peace in the ritual, believing that no sin was too great to be forgiven if only confessed sincerely. Some confessed weekly, even daily, burdened by the thought that a single impure thought might condemn them forever. The priests, too, were human. Some were compassionate, listening with patience and offering absolution with kindness. Others used their power cruelly, manipulating fear to maintain authority. A few even succumbed to the very temptations they heard about, drawn into secret relationships with those who came seeking forgiveness. There are records of priests fathering children in secrecy, of nuns confessing forbidden desires to confessors who comforted them too closely. The confessional, meant to cleanse sin, sometimes became the setting for it. Over time, the act of confession shaped medieval culture in profound ways. It taught people to see themselves through the eyes of the Church, to measure their worth by their purity. Every desire was something to be analyzed and confessed. Love, once spontaneous, became shadowed by guilt. Even within marriage, the line between affection and sin was thin. A husband might confess to enjoying his wife too much. A woman might confess to wanting affection beyond duty. These were not crimes of action alone. They were crimes of thought, of the heart itself. The confessional manuals grew more elaborate over the centuries. Some priests became almost scholars of sin, cataloging the many ways the flesh could lead the soul astray. They warned of temptation through touch, sight, or even smell. They described in detail what could happen if two people allowed themselves to linger too long in conversation, or if one looked upon another with affection. It was a strange blend of fear and fascination, an endless study of what was forbidden, written in the name of holiness. For those who lived under this system, the confessional became a mirror. It showed them who they were in the eyes of the Church, frail, sinful, always needing forgiveness. But it also offered a strange kind of intimacy. In a world where so much was forbidden, confession was one of the few places where people could speak honestly about what they felt. For a moment, the burden of secrecy lifted, even if only to replace it with repentance. And so, through countless whispered words in countless darkened chapels, the confessional became one of the most powerful inventions of the medieval world. It revealed not only the sins people committed, but the humanity they shared, their longing, their weakness, their hope for mercy. Behind every whispered confession was the same unspoken truth, that no matter how hard one tried to silence desire, it always found a way to be heard, even if only through the cracks of the confessional screen. In medieval Europe, marriage was not simply a bond of love or companionship. It was a contract, a duty, a sacred vow wrapped tightly in the expectations of the Church and the needs of society. Love, as we understand it today, was not its foundation. Instead, it was a duty performed for the continuation of family, property, and faith. Yet, beneath the surface of obedience and piety, there existed the quiet hum of longing. The tension between obligation and desire defined many marriages in the Middle Ages, turning even the most holy of unions into silent battlegrounds between body and soul. For most, marriage was arranged long before affection could take root. Families viewed it as a transaction, a merging of estates, alliances, and social standing. A nobleman's daughter might be promised to a neighboring lord to secure peace or land. A peasant might marry to share the burden of labor or survival. Romantic attachment, though celebrated in songs and poetry, rarely guided the decision. Love could come later, or not at all. The Church sanctified these unions, declaring them holy and binding, yet also reminding couples that their purpose was procreation, not pleasure. The Church's influence over marriage reached every corner of daily life. It declared that the act of love between husband and wife was only acceptable when performed within the bounds of marriage, and for the purpose of conceiving children. Anything beyond that, even within marriage, was seen as indulgence. The idea of desire itself was treated with suspicion. Theologians debated whether a husband who enjoyed his wife's body too much was committing sin, even though he fulfilled his marital duty. Pleasure, they believed, distracted from the spiritual purpose of the act, to continue the creation of souls for God's kingdom. For women, the expectations were even more confining. A wife's role was to be obedient, modest, and chaste, even within marriage. Her body was her husband's property, and refusing him could be considered a sin. Yet she was also warned against being too forward or desiring him too eagerly. A delicate balance had to be maintained to fulfill her duties without appearing lustful. Her virtue was her most prized possession, and her reputation depended on how she carried herself both in public and in private. The weight of purity rested heavily on her shoulders, while her husband's transgressions were often overlooked or forgiven. Despite these restrictions, human nature persisted. Many medieval couples developed genuine affection, finding small ways to express tenderness in a world that discouraged it. Letters between spouses, especially among the literate elite, reveal warmth, longing, and care. Some husbands described missing their wives' company beyond physical desire, while some wives wrote of their loneliness and yearning for closeness. These private moments, though rarely acknowledged publicly, showed that love could grow even in the soil of duty. It was quiet, often hidden, but deeply human. Of course, not every marriage was peaceful. Adultery was a constant concern, and the church devoted much energy to condemning it. For men, infidelity was frowned upon but often tolerated, especially among the powerful. For women, it could mean disgrace, punishment, or even death. The double standard was clear. Men's desires were weaknesses to be confessed, while women's desires were threats to be contained. Stories of unfaithful queens, passionate peasants, and forbidden affairs filled both sermons and gossip, serving as warnings of the chaos that came when desire escaped its cage. In noble courts, love sometimes took on another form, the ideal of courtly love. This was the poetic tradition, where a knight pledged himself to a lady, often one already married, and adored her from afar. It was meant to be pure and spiritual, untouched by the physical. Yet in truth, it blurred the line between devotion and desire. These stories of longing inspired countless songs and tales, but they also reflected a subtle rebellion against the rigid confines of marriage. They celebrated passion, even when forbidden, suggesting that love could be more powerful than law. Among common folk, the rules were simpler but just as binding. Marriage was both survival and social necessity. Yet even here, passion found its place, in dances after harvest, in shared glances across fields, in whispered promises under starlight. The church's laws could not fully erase the joy people took in one another, even if they felt guilt afterward. The heart, as ever, did not bend easily to authority. In the end, marriage in the Middle Ages was an uneasy mix of sanctity and sin, obedience and temptation. It was a structure built to contain human passion, yet within its walls, that passion continued to breathe. Every union, whether arranged or chosen, holy or broken, carried with it the eternal question that haunted the medieval mind. Could love exist without sin? And perhaps, for those who dared to feel deeply, the answer was no, but they loved anyway, quietly, imperfectly, and against all odds. In the stillness of monastery corridors, where footsteps echoed against cold stone, and prayers rose like smoke into the vaulted air, one might imagine purity reigning unchallenged. Monks and nuns devoted their lives to God, renouncing worldly pleasures, possessions, and passions. But beneath the quiet hum of devotion, desire often stirred. The very isolation, meant to silence the flesh, sometimes amplified it. In the medieval monastery, temptation was not a distant rumor. It lived within the walls, cloaked in silence and prayer. Life in a monastery followed a strict rhythm. Each day began before dawn, with the tolling of bells calling the faithful to their first prayers. Work, study, and worship filled the hours that followed. Meals were taken in silence. Eyes were lowered, voices soft, hearts directed toward heaven. Yet, no matter how deeply the monks and nuns prayed, they could not escape their humanity. The body they sought to deny reminded them daily of its needs. Fasting and self-denial were meant to purify the soul, but they often only heightened awareness of what was forbidden. The more one tried to kill desire, the more stubbornly it lived on. The Church knew this struggle well. Manuals written for confessors warned of the special temptations that plagued those in religious life. There were accounts of monks who fell in love with fellow brothers, of nuns who developed tender attachments to the sisters they lived beside, and of secret relationships that defied every vow. Some sought solace in letters, others in whispered meetings in gardens or cloisters. Many repented with tears and punishments, flagellating themselves to drive away the sin of lust. Yet for every tale of repentance, there were countless others of hidden longing that never truly died. One of the most famous cases was that of Abelard and Heloise, a scholar and his brilliant pupil, whose passionate affair scandalized the medieval world. Abelard, a man of God, fell deeply in love with Heloise, and their union produced a child. When the affair was discovered, tragedy followed. Abelard was punished severely, and Heloise was forced into a convent. There, she lived out her life as a nun, her letters to Abelard filled with both devotion and unrepentant love. Their story, whispered through generations, revealed a painful truth. Even those devoted to God were not immune to the pull of the heart. Within monasteries, the line between affection and sin was often blurred. Companionship was allowed, but intimacy was not. Yet isolation breeds closeness, and the bonds between brothers or sisters in faith sometimes grew into something deeper. In some cases, these relationships were tender and emotional. In others, they crossed into physical desire. The punishments for such transgressions could be harsh: confinement, public penance, or expulsion. But secrecy was a powerful shield. Many kept their struggles hidden, confessing only enough to find forgiveness without full exposure. There were also darker stories. Power within monastic life was not equally distributed, and authority could be abused. Priors or abbots sometimes took advantage of novices, cloaking coercion in a language of spiritual guidance. Women in convents were especially vulnerable, dependent on male confessors and patrons. Behind the sacred vows, there were human failings: jealousy, manipulation, forbidden affection. These stories rarely made their way into official records, but traces remain in letters, court documents, and whispered accounts preserved by chroniclers who dared to write what others tried to forget. Still, not all expressions of love within religious life were condemned. Some mystics described their devotion to God in terms that blurred the line between the spiritual and the sensual. They spoke of divine union as a kind of sacred ecstasy, of feeling consumed by love that transcended the flesh but echoed its sensations. Saints like Teresa of Avila and Catherine of Siena, though writing centuries later, described their encounters with God in language that sounded almost intimate. It was as if the longing they were forbidden to express in earthly terms found a new outlet in divine worship. Lust and love were transformed, but not destroyed. For those living within these cloistered walls, temptation was a lifelong companion. It arrived quietly, in dreams, in fleeting touches, in the warmth of companionship. Some resisted until death, their struggle unseen and unspoken. Others fell and repented, their sins becoming lessons for future generations. But all shared the same human truth, that even within the holiest places, the heart could not be fully silenced. In the end, the monasteries of the Middle Ages were not immune to sin. They were microcosms of the world outside, filled with devotion, conflict, fear, and longing. Lust behind monastery walls was not simply a scandal. It was a reflection of the enduring human spirit. No vow, no rule could entirely erase the longing to be seen, to be touched, to be loved. And so, beneath the echo of prayer and the weight of silence, The ancient dance between holiness and desire continued, quietly, endlessly, within those sacred stones. Adultery in the Middle Ages was more than a personal betrayal. It was a moral offense, a legal crime, and for some, a death sentence. It threatened not only marriages, but entire families, dynasties, and even kingdoms. In a world where faith and law intertwined, the act of being unfaithful carried heavy consequences, both spiritual and worldly. Yet, despite the sermons, the punishments, and the shame, adultery remained one of the most persistent sins of the medieval age. Behind every castle gate and cottage door, forbidden passion found its way. The Church preached that marriage was sacred, a union blessed by God, and that any violation of it was an insult to divine order. Priests warned that those who strayed would not only suffer in life, but also face torment in the afterlife. The sin of adultery was often compared to treason against God himself, because it broke the vows made before him. And still, confessions poured in of women who sought comfort in another's arms while their husbands fought wars, and of men who visited mistresses or servants despite their promises of fidelity. Human weakness persisted, even in the face of eternal damnation. For women, the risk was far greater. A man's unfaithfulness was often excused as natural weakness, but a woman's was treated as a moral catastrophe. Her body was considered her husband's property, and to share it with another was seen as theft and betrayal. In some places, adulterous women were publicly humiliated, paraded through towns in shame, their hair shorn, their clothes torn. In harsher cases, the punishment was death by stoning or burning. The severity of the response revealed not only moral outrage, but also fear of uncertain lineage, of illegitimate heirs, of power slipping out of male control. Among the nobility, adultery carried political consequences. A queen's fidelity determined the legitimacy of her children, and by extension, the stability of entire kingdoms. Rumors of infidelity could spark wars or end dynasties. One of the most infamous cases was that of Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose intelligence and independence made her both admired and feared. She was accused, though never proven, of unfaithfulness to her husband, King Louis VII of France. Later, as the wife of Henry II of England, she supported her sons in rebellion against him, an act that many claimed was born of both vengeance and passion. Whether or not the stories were true, they revealed how closely adultery was tied to power and politics. Among ordinary people, the story was simpler but no less tragic. Adultery often sprang from loneliness, neglect, or desire that duty could not satisfy. Peasants lived hard lives, their marriages often arranged for survival rather than love. When affection was missing, temptation grew. Sometimes it led to quiet affairs that lasted years, hidden from neighbors and priests. Other times, it was discovered and punished swiftly. Church courts handled countless cases, assigning penance or fines to those caught. The punishment varied by region, but the shame was universal. A stain on one's honor could linger long after the sin was confessed. In literature and song, however, adultery took on a different life. Troubadours and poets romanticized forbidden love, turning it into a symbol of passion and rebellion. The story of Lancelot and Queen Guinevere, though condemned by moralists, captivated audiences across Europe. Their love, doomed and destructive, was portrayed as noble and transcendent, greater than law or faith. Such tales blurred the boundary between sin and virtue, suggesting that love itself, even when forbidden, could be holy in its own way. These stories gave voice to feelings that real life suppressed: the longing for connection, the ache of desire, the defiance of duty. Behind closed doors, even the clergy were not immune. Bishops, priests, and monks sometimes fathered children in secret. In one infamous case, a priest's long affair with a married woman led to scandal that rocked his parish, but rather than being exiled, he was quietly transferred to another post. The Church condemned adultery publicly, yet often handled it privately, aware that too much exposure could damage its own authority. This quiet hypocrisy only fueled more whispers, more suspicion, and more sin. In the end, adultery in the Middle Ages was less about passion alone and more about power over bodies, over reputations, over souls. It revealed the double standards of a world where men's sins were forgiven and women as were fatal, where the church preached purity but thrived on confession, and where love itself became a dangerous act. Those who strayed knew the risks, yet many did so anyway, driven by something stronger than fear, the simple, unstoppable human need to be desired and to feel alive. And so, beneath the watchful eyes of priests and kings, the sin of adultery continued, as old as time and as inevitable as desire itself. It lived in silence, in secrecy, in glances across candlelight. It was condemned from the pulpit and immortalized in poetry. It was proof, once again, that even in a world ruled by faith, the heart followed its own laws. In the medieval world, virginity was more than a state of the body. It was a symbol of purity, holiness, and power, a currency of virtue that could define a woman as worth and shape her destiny. The Church elevated chastity as the highest form of devotion, second only to martyrdom, and society followed its lead. A virgin was not only innocent of sin, but also closer to the divine. Her untouched body represented spiritual perfection, a mirror of the purity that humanity lost in the Garden of Eden. Yet, beneath this veneration of virginity lay a darker truth. It was also a form of control. For women, the expectation of virginity began at birth. From childhood, girls were taught to guard their modesty, to lower their eyes, to speak softly, and to avoid the gaze of men. Their purity was not their own. It was their family's honor, a dowry of virtue to be offered at marriage. A father's reputation could rise or fall on the chastity of his daughters. Virginity, in this way, became property, something to be protected, traded, and proven. The proof of it was often a matter of life and death. On wedding nights, families awaited the display of blood-stained sheets as evidence of purity, a ritual both intimate and cruel. The Church's reverence for virginity came from deep theological roots. The Virgin Mary, the Mother of Christ, became the ideal woman, pure, obedient, untouched. Her perfection set an impossible standard for all others. Saints and theologians praised celibacy as a higher calling, arguing that those who remained untouched by desire lived closest to God. Women who chose the convent over marriage were celebrated as brides of Christ, their vows of chastity making them spiritual equals to the angels. Yet, while some truly sought this life for faith, others were forced into it by circumstance, by fathers avoiding dowries, by families protecting inheritance, or by scandal they could not erase. The obsession with virginity extended far beyond religion. It shaped politics and power. A noble woman's worth on the marriage market depended on her purity, and alliances between kingdoms could hinge on the reputation of a single woman. Queens and princesses lived under constant scrutiny, their bodies politicized and their virtue turned into a public matter. Even rumors of impropriety could destroy marriages and spark wars. The fate of nations, at times, rested on whether a woman was believed to be a virgin. But virginity also carried a paradoxical kind of strength. In a world where most women's value depended on their connection to men, a virgin could claim a kind of independence. Saints like Agnes, Cecilia, and Catherine were celebrated for rejecting marriage and choosing spiritual purity instead. Their refusal to yield made them powerful symbols of resistance, women who defied emperors and executioners alike to preserve their faith. Their stories inspired generations, showing that virginity could be not only submission, but defiance. By keeping their bodies untouched, they claimed control over their own souls. This idea of purity as power extended into the mystical and the miraculous. The relics of virgin saints were said to hold healing powers. Their bodies, preserved incorrupt after death, were believed to emit divine fragrance. Pilgrims traveled miles to pray at their shrines, seeking protection or forgiveness. The Church used these stories to reinforce its moral teachings. But for ordinary people, they also offered comfort, proof that even in a corrupt world, innocence could endure. Still, for most women, virginity was not freedom but burden. It was something that could be taken without consent, stolen through violence, and yet the victim was often blamed. Medieval law treated rape not as a crime against the woman, but as a crime against her father or husband, an offense against property, not person. The loss of virginity, even through force, could ruin a woman's life. Some sought refuge in convents, where vows of chastity offered protection and a new identity. Others lived in silence, carrying the weight of a purity they could never regain. There were also those who challenged the ideal altogether. Courtesans, widows, and outspoken women refused to let their worth be defined by chastity. They lived outside the boundaries of what the Church called pure, and in doing so, they became both feared and desired. Their existence exposed the hypocrisy of a society that worshipped virginity, but could not live without its opposite. In them, power took a different shape, not the holiness of denial, but the confidence of experience. The cult of virginity defined much of medieval life, but it also revealed the contradictions of the age. Purity was prized, yet passion was unavoidable. The body was treated as both sacred and sinful, and while men could sin and be forgiven, women were measured by a standard they could never escape. Virginity was both a crown and a chain, a source of honor and a lifelong burden. It gave some women power and condemned others to silence. In the end, it was not only about the body, but about control, over desire, over identity, and over the story that history would tell about them. In the candlelight of monasteries and the gossip of marketplaces, the word virgin carried weight far beyond its meaning. It was the axis around which medieval morality turned, the line that divided saint from sinner. And though time would change the language, the idea that purity is power and that the body is both sacred and dangerous would echo through centuries to come. Of all the strange powers the medieval Church claimed, perhaps none was more intimate than its reach into the private chambers of its followers. In an age where faith shaped every breath and every meal, even the act of love between husband and wife fell under the Church's watchful eye. The bedroom was not beyond its authority. It was, in many ways, the final frontier of control. What should have been a private expression of affection and humanity was transformed into a carefully measured ritual, bound by rules that blurred the line between holiness and intrusion. The Church did not shy away from instructing the faithful on what was allowed and what was forbidden in the marital bed. Manuals for confessors and moral treatises written by theologians detailed every possible question of conduct. When, how, and even why a couple could be intimate was spelled out in meticulous language. The guiding principle was simple yet severe. The only acceptable purpose for such acts was procreation. Pleasure was suspect, affection dangerous, and passion a sin. To seek joy in the flesh was to indulge the devil's whisper. Thus, the Church tried to sanctify what it could not destroy, blessing marriage but condemning desire. Certain days and seasons were deemed unfit for intimacy. Couples were forbidden from lying together on Sundays. Holy days, during Lent, Advent, and many other periods of fasting or mourning. By some counts, nearly half the year was off-limits. Even the times of day were debated, as was the manner in which the act occurred. Anything that deviated from the natural order, defined narrowly and rigidly, was considered sinful. Confessionals became places where such details were scrutinized, and the penance for breaking these invisible boundaries could be harsh. The body, even in marriage, was a thing to be tamed, not celebrated. The language used by the Church was vivid and often unsettling. Theologians warned that a husband who desired his wife too much was guilty of lust even if he acted only with her. Wives who sought their husbands eagerly were accused of being temptresses, ruled by carnal appetite. In this moral landscape, even love could be dangerous. A faithful couple could find themselves constantly second-guessing their own hearts, afraid that affection might lead them astray. The bed, meant to be a place of rest and closeness, became another site of guilt and anxiety. This obsession with purity created endless contradictions. Priests preached chastity, but heard confessions filled with the details of sin. They studied human desire so closely that their writings sometimes bordered on the erotic, describing temptation in such detail that it betrayed a hidden fascination. Manuals like the Summa Theologica by Thomas Aquinas and earlier works by Augustine wrestled with the same paradox. If God made humans capable of pleasure, could it truly be evil to feel it? The official answer was yes, and yet the very need to ask the question revealed how deeply the issue troubled even the most pious minds. The Church's control over intimacy extended beyond words. Laws were passed to enforce moral conduct, and public punishments were used to make examples of those who strayed. Adulterers were paraded through towns, fornicators paid fines, and those accused of unnatural acts faced exile, imprisonment, or worse. But the rules did not fall evenly. Men were given more leeway, their sins seen as lapses. Women bore the heavier burden of purity. Their reputations, their safety, and their futures could all be destroyed by suspicion alone. The Church's teachings reinforced these inequalities, making the female body both a vessel of sin and a symbol of virtue. Even within the clergy, the struggle with desire was constant. Celibacy was enforced for priests, yet many secretly broke their vows. Parish records and letters from bishops reveal repeated attempts to curb this hidden sin. Priests fathering children, monks maintaining mistresses, and bishops issuing stern warnings that went unheeded. The Church's own human frailty mirrored the very behavior it condemned, and yet it continued to dictate the morality of others. The contradiction became part of medieval life. Everyone sinned, and everyone pretended not to. And still, despite the weight of these rules, love found a way to survive. Couples shared quiet tenderness behind closed doors, learning to navigate guilt and grace in equal measure. Some used the Church's teachings as a guide for discipline. Others simply ignored them, trusting the rhythm of their own hearts. In the stories and songs that drifted through medieval towns, tales of knights and maidens, of husbands and wives, there lingered a softer truth. That affection, though forbidden, was never forgotten. By claiming authority over the bedroom, the Church asserted control over the most private corner of human life. It defined sin not just in deeds but in thoughts, turning even love into something that needed confession. Yet the more it tried to suppress desire, the more it proved how deeply human it was. The body might be disciplined, but the heart was not so easily ruled. In the end, the Church's presence in the bedroom did not erase passion. It only made it more secret, more forbidden, and therefore, in many ways, more powerful. In the hush of night, beneath the same crosses that crowned the cities, countless couples whispered their prayers and their desires in the same breath. Between faith and flesh, they found their own quiet balance, not of sin or virtue, but of simple, enduring humanity. In the shadows of medieval villages and royal courts alike, whispers of magic drifted through the air, tales of charms, potions, and spells that could bend hearts and awaken desire. In an age ruled by faith and fear, where the Church condemned lust as sin and punished those who dared indulge in it, people still searched for ways to control it, to ignite it, or to make it disappear. Love was dangerous, but magic offered a tempting promise to make it obey. The story of lustful magic in the Middle Ages is one of superstition and longing, of those who sought power over the heart in a world that demanded purity. Medieval people lived in a world they believed was alive with unseen forces. The earth, the stars, and the human body were all linked in a great divine order. Desire was not only an emotion, it was a cosmic influence, something that could be manipulated by knowledge or prayer, by herbs or spells. Love magic sat at the border between religion and heresy. Some said it drew upon natural forces that God had created. Others insisted it was the work of the devil. The line between the two was thin, and crossing it could mean ruin. The simplest love magic came from the kitchen or the field. Wise women, known for their herbs and charms, would mix strange ingredients, powdered mandrake root, honey, crushed rose petals, or drops of blood. Some claimed a potion made from the yolk of a dove's egg could make a man fall deeply in love, while others swore by more unsettling recipes, ground bones hair, or even sweat from a lover's clothing. Many of these mixtures were harmless, more superstition than science, but the belief in their power was very real. A sip from a cup, a charm worn close to the heart, could fill someone with hope that love might finally come their way. But not all who sought love magic did so for affection. Some wanted to inflame a desire, to bend another's will, or to force what was forbidden. The Church viewed such acts as grave sin, for they seemed to strip free will from the soul, a power that belonged only to God. In its eyes, to use magic to stir lust was to commit a form of spiritual assault. Confession records from across Europe described cases of men and women accused of using enchantments to seduce or control others. Sometimes the accused were punished harshly. Other times they escaped, claiming ignorance or repentance. Yet the stories continued, and so did the belief that love could be conjured like fire from flint. The fear of magical seduction ran deep in medieval thought. Men who fell suddenly in love might blame witchcraft rather than their own hearts. Husbands accused wives of using charms to keep them faithful, and wives accused rivals of casting spells to steal their husbands' affections. Even kings were not immune. Chronicles tell of rulers who believed they had been enchanted by women seeking power, and who turned against them in paranoia. The blending of lust, love, and magic created fertile ground for suspicion, especially when women were involved. To accuse a woman of witchcraft was often to accuse her of being too desirable, too knowledgeable, or simply too free. Yet for many women, love magic was less about control and more about survival. In a society that gave them few choices over marriage or affection, these small rituals offered a sense of agency. A charm whispered into the night, a potion shared in secret. These were acts of hope in a world where love was often arranged or denied. Folk healers and so-called witches filled the void left by priests who could not speak of passion. Their remedies promised what the Church could not, a way to make the heart obey its longing. Not all forms of lustful magic were condemned. Some were disguised as piety. A woman might pray to Saint Agnes to reveal her future husband in a dream, or wear a blessed ring said to ensure fidelity. Certain relics were believed to have power over love and desire, blessed by saints who supposedly healed hearts as easily as they healed wounds. The boundaries between religion and superstition blurred constantly. A prayer might be a spell, and a spell might sound like a prayer, depending on who was listening. As the centuries passed, the Church grew more fearful of such practices. What had once been tolerated as harmless folklore became evidence of witchcraft. The Inquisition, born to root out heresy, began to see love magic as a dangerous gateway to the devil's influence. Women who sold charms or mixed potions were accused of trafficking with demons, of summoning spirits to control men's minds. Some were imprisoned, others executed, their supposed crimes often no more than selling herbs or reading fortunes. The same knowledge that had once offered comfort now became a death sentence. Still, belief in love magic never truly died. It persisted in whispers and secret gestures, a lock of hair hidden under a pillow, a name written 3 times and burned in candlelight, a kiss given with a spell. Even those who condemned it often feared its power. The idea that love could be manipulated spoke to something deeper, the recognition that desire itself is a kind of enchantment. It can rise unbidden, take hold without consent, and change the course of a life. In the quiet corners of medieval towns, where superstition met faith and fear met longing, people sought to understand love the only way they knew how, by trying to control it. Whether through herbs, prayers, or whispered charms, they reached for something beyond reason, something divine or dangerous. And though the church tried to stamp it out, lustful magic remained, flickering like candlelight in the darkness, a small, stubborn rebellion against the tyranny of guilt and the mystery of the heart. In the courts of medieval Europe, where power was draped in silk and gold, lust and politics often shared the same bed. Kings, queens, and courtiers lived under the constant gaze of the church and their subjects. Yet behind the heavy curtains of royal chambers, the rules of sin were bent, broken, and sometimes rewritten entirely. Royal marriages were rarely born of love. They were instruments of alliance, binding kingdoms together through vows of convenience. But the heart, as history has shown time and again, has little regard for treaties. And so, beneath crowns and sanctified unions, desire thrived in secret, shaping the fate of nations. For kings, infidelity was almost expected. Their marriages served diplomacy, but their passions belonged elsewhere. Chronicles from England to France are filled with tales of monarchs whose love affairs became both legend and scandal. King Henry II of England and his mistress Rosamund Clifford became a story whispered across the land, a tale of beauty, betrayal, and vengeance. His wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was no stranger to intrigue herself, and though much of what was said about her was clouded in rumor, she was accused of having lovers of her own. The royal court became a stage where love and power performed dangerous dance, and every secret had the potential to shake a throne. In France, King Philip IV's daughters-in-law became infamous when accused of adultery in what came to be known as the Tour de Nesle affair. The scandal erupted in 1314 when the young women were accused of taking lovers from among the knights of the royal household. 2 were imprisoned for life, one allegedly executed, and the knights were publicly tortured and put to death. The accusations destroyed reputations, ended marriages, and destabilized dynasties. Whether true or exaggerated, the story revealed how deeply the politics of lust could pierce the heart of royal power. Queens, for their part, lived under far harsher scrutiny. A king's infidelity might be seen as weakness, but a queen's was treason. Her fidelity guaranteed the legitimacy of heirs, and any suspicion of betrayal could unravel an entire realm. Yet some queens defied these expectations with courage or recklessness, depending on who told the tale. Isabella of France, known as the She-Wolf of France, was rumored to have taken a lover, Roger Mortimer, with whom she conspired against her husband, Edward II of England. Together they overthrew the king, and though her motives were political, the whispers of passion colored every account. To her enemies, she was a seductress who used her body for power. To her supporters, she was a woman who took back control from a corrupt husband and a failing crown. Royal mistresses, too, wielded remarkable influence. Though their love was technically sin, it often became the unspoken foundation of political power. Kings granted them lands, titles, and wealth, and through them, favors were bought and sold. These women lived in a strange duality, both reviled and envied, both sinners and queens in everything but name. In later centuries, their power would only grow, but even in the Middle Ages, they could sway courtly decisions and shape history through a whisper in the right ear or a glance at the right moment. The Church condemned such relationships, yet it often turned a blind eye when the sinner wore a crown. Excommunication was a threat, but rarely enforced against those whose armies could crush entire bishoprics. Still, the tension between divine authority and earthly desire was constant. Kings attended Mass in the morning, and visited their lovers at night. Confessors offered absolution with one hand and accepted royal donations with the other. The contradiction became the rhythm of medieval court life. Sin followed by penance, penance followed by sin again. It was not only monarchs who succumbed to forbidden's love. Courtiers, poets, and noblewomen played their parts in the great theater of passion. The tradition of courtly love, born in the courts of southern France, turned desire into an art form. Knights pledged themselves to noble ladies, often married to other men, and declared their devotion through poetry, music, and secret gestures. Though these relationships were supposed to be chaste, reality often blurred the lines. Behind the verses and the songs, the thrill of the forbiddens lingered. Love, in its most idealized form, was also love in its most dangerous. Even the gossip of the common people mirrored these royal scandals. Songs and ballads carried stories of kings who sinned and queens who defied, mixing truth with legend. These tales were told in taverns, markets, and hearths, serving as both entertainment and moral lesson. They reminded the people that even those crowned by God were still human, weak, passionate, and imperfect. In this way, royal lust became a kind of public confession, played out on the stage of history. For all the secrecy and scandal, the truth was simple. Royal blood did not protect against desire. Kings and queens, like the peasants they ruled, were bound by the same temptations. The difference was that their sins echoed farther and cost more dearly. An affair between lovers could destroy a family. An affair between monarchs could destroy a nation. Yet they risked it all, again and again, driven by the same ancient hunger, to be wanted, to be seen, to be free, if only for a moment, from the weight of crowns and commandments. And so, behind the gilded walls of palaces, passion burned quietly, shaping wars, alliances, and legacies. The medieval world may have called it sin, but history remembers it as something more, the truth of humanity, even at its highest heights, caught between holiness and desire. To the medieval mind, lust was both a poison and a possibility. It was a doorway to damnation, yet also a path that some believed could lead, paradoxically, toward divine understanding. The tension between the flesh and the spirit defined the age. Priests thundered from pulpits that lust was the enemy of the soul, but mystics whispered that passion, when purified, could mirror the intensity of God's love. This contradiction between sin and salvation ran through every corner of medieval thought, shaping not only theology, but art, literature, and the hidden hearts of the faithful. In sermons and confessional manuals, lust was called one of the 7 deadly sins, a gateway to every other corruption. It was the spark that ignited pride, envy, and wrath, the root of all human weakness. To feel desire was to feel the echo of Adam and Eve's fall, the moment when innocence was lost and shame was born. The body, with its appetites and urges, was a reminder of that original failure. The Church's mission was to tame it, to redirect its energy toward prayer and obedience. Yet for all the talk of control, lust fascinated those who sought to suppress it. They studied it, described it, and feared it with the same intensity. For ordinary people, lust was both inescapable and unavoidable. It was there in a glance across a market stall, in the warmth of a shared bed, in the quiet thoughts that came unbidden at night. The Church's teaching turned these moments into battles of conscience. To resist was to win favor with heaven. To yield was to fall into sin. But as many discovered, the more one tried to resist, the more powerful temptation became. Lust was not merely physical, it was spiritual hunger disguised as flesh. It made people feel alive, even as it filled them with guilt. This paradox was the heart of the medieval struggle. Among the clergy, the war against lust was constant and visible. Monks starved themselves, flagellated their bodies, and isolated their minds in an attempt to banish desire. Some lived in perpetual fasting, believing hunger could cleanse the soul of passion. Others spent hours in prayer, begging for deliverance from the images that haunted their thoughts. Yet, within the silence of monasteries, the same sin they condemned often thrived in secret. It was as if the more they sought purity, the more acutely they felt temptation's sting. In their writings, one can sense both agony and awe-agony at their failure, and awe at the strange power of what they fought. Mystics, however, saw something different in desire. They spoke of divine love in language, so passionate it bordered on erotic. To them, the longing that humans felt for one another was a reflection of the soul's longing for God. The Song of Songs, that ancient poem of love and sensuality, was interpreted not as lustful verse, but as an allegory for divine union. Saints and visionaries described their experiences of God in terms of rapture and ecstasy. They felt consumed, embraced, pierced by light and love. In these moments, lust became not sin, but symbol a way to express emotions that ordinary language could not contain. This mystical perspective did not erase the sinfulness of lust in the eyes of the Church, but it added a layer of complexity. Desire, when directed toward the divine, could be holy. When directed toward another person, it was perilous. The difference lay in the object, not the feeling itself. Some theologians dared to suggest that lust, properly transformed, could lead the soul upward, that human love might serve as a reflection, however flawed, of God's perfect love. It was a dangerous idea, one that bordered on heresy, yet it persisted in the writings of poets and mystics who saw no clear boundary between passion and prayer. In art and literature, this tension came alive. Medieval painters depicted Eve's temptation, David's lust for Bathsheba, and Mary Magdalene's repentance with equal fascination. The human body was shown as both sacred and profane, a vessel of sin and a work of divine creation. In the poems of the troubadours, love was exalted, purified through suffering, transformed into something nearly holy. To love deeply, they said, was to suffer nobly, to approach the divine through pain. Lust, in these verses, was not evil, but energy, something that, if guided by honor and restraint, could elevate the soul. The Church's effort to contain lust often backfired. By naming it forbiddance, it gave it power. By surrounding it with fear, it made it alluring. Sermons describing the torments of sin often lingered on the details of temptation, painting images that stirred the imagination, even as they warned against it. In trying to suppress the body, the Church inadvertently kept it at the center of thought. Lust became the shadow of holiness ever present, ever chasing the light. For the people of the Middle Ages, the path between sin and salvation was narrow and uncertain. They prayed to be free of temptation, yet they were drawn to it all the same. Some found peace in confession, others in denial, and a few in acceptance, that perhaps the soul could not be separated from the body without losing its humanity. They lived in a world where desire was a sin, yet it was also the very thing that made life vivid, that gave meaning to love, art, and faith. In the end, lust in medieval times was not just about passion or punishment. It was a mirror, reflecting both the weakness and the beauty of the human condition. It revealed how deeply people longed, not only for one another, but for connection, for purpose, for something beyond themselves. Whether it led to sin or salvation depended on how it was seen, how it was lived, and perhaps, beneath all the fear and shame, that was the Church's unspoken lesson, that the same fire that burns can also illuminate, and that the heart's greatest danger might also be its only path to grace. In the medieval imagination, woman was both sacred and dangerous. She was the Virgin Mary, and she was Eve. She was purity incarnate and the cause of mankind's fall. Between these two extremes, all real women were forced to live, judged and measured by a story written long before they were born. The Church preached that woman was the weaker vessel, the doorway through which sin entered the world, and the constant threat to male virtue. Every sermon about temptation, every painting of the fall, every whispered confession of lust carried the same undertone, that women were to blame. From childhood, girls were taught that their very existence was a source of temptation. They were instructed to cover their bodies, to lower their eyes, and to guard their virtue as if it were a shield against damnation. Beauty, that most natural of gifts, was treated as both blessing and curse. A beautiful woman was admired and feared in equal measure. Preachers warned that her face could undo a saint. Her voice could stir sin in a priest's heart. Her very presence could test the will of the righteous. To be desirable was to be dangerous, and to be noticed was to risk condemnation. This belief had deep roots in theology. The story of Eve loomed over medieval thought like a shadow. She was the first to sin, the one who listened to the serpent, the one who tempted Adam. From that single act, an entire gender was judged. Writers like St. Jerome and Tertullian called women the gateway of the devil, responsible for bringing death into the world. Even when saints and scholars praised the Virgin Mary as the new Eve, her perfection only deepened the contrast. No ordinary woman could match her purity, and every flaw, every impulse, was proof of humanity's fallen nature. In daily life, these ideas shaped everything from law to love. A man's sin of lust was often forgiven as weakness, but a woman's was treated as corruption. Her desires were rarely seen as her own. They were said to be planted by demons or provoked by the devil's whisper. A man might confess his temptation, but she was made into the temptation itself. This view justified the strict control over women's lives. Their bodies belonged first to their fathers, then to their husbands, and finally, in some cases, to the church. Their virtue was their value, and any stain upon it was nearly impossible to erase. Even within marriage, women bore the weight of blame. If a husband strayed, it was said that his wife had failed to please or to guide him. If a man fell into lust, it was because a woman's beauty ensnared him. Women were instructed to be modest in speech and dress, for even an uncovered ankle or a laugh in public could be seen as invitation. The moral burden placed upon them was immense. They were expected to suppress not only their desires, but the possibility that others might desire them. It was an impossible balance, and one that often led to suffering and silence. Despite these restrictions, women found ways to exist within, and sometimes against, this harsh moral world. Some joined convents, seeking the protection of the church and the peace of a celibate life. Within those walls, they could study, write, and lead, though still under male authority. Others used their influence more subtly, shaping politics through marriage, guiding men through counsel, or expressing themselves through art and letters. Mystics like Hildegard of Bingen and Mechthild of Magdeburg spoke of divine love in language that transformed desire into holiness. In their visions, passion was not evil, but a force that could lead to understanding of God's grace. Their voices challenged the idea that women were only instruments of temptation. But outside those rare exceptions, suspicion never slept. Women who spoke too freely, who dressed too boldly, or who simply refused to obey could find themselves accused of witchcraft or moral corruption. The same beauty that inspired poems one year could invite accusations the next. Gossip and fear could destroy reputations faster than any sin could. The Inquisition's records are filled with names of women punished not for deeds, but for perceptions. Too independent, too intelligent, too alluring. The medieval world's fear of temptation became, in truth, a fear of women's power. Art and literature reflected this duality. In illuminated manuscripts, women appeared as saints with halos, or as seductresses with serpents at their feet. Poets wrote of them as goddesses one moment and destroyers the next. The story of Helen of Troy, of Delilah, of Bathsheba, all reinforced the same message. Woman was beauty and danger intertwined, love and sin in one fragile form. The medieval mind could not separate desire from blame, and so it laid the burden of both upon the same shoulders. And yet, through it all, women endured. They found ways to shape their own narratives, even within the constraints of sin and virtue. Some used their supposed weakness as disguise, moving quietly behind the scenes where real influence was possible. Others turned their reputation for temptation into power, manipulating the very system that sought to control them. The courtesan, the queen, the mystic, each in her own way, challenged the story that had been written for her. The medieval church might have taught that women were the cause of man's downfall, but history tells another story. It was women who carried faith into families, who healed the sick, who built and preserved communities, while men fought wars and sought salvation in distant monasteries. They bore the weight of blame, but they also bore the world forward. Temptation may have been the name men gave to women's power, but that power never truly belonged to the devil. It belonged to life itself, to the same force that made love, birth, beauty, and art possible. And so, even in an age that tried to silence them, women remained the heart of the human story. Both sin and salvation, feared and adored, condemned and indispensable. Beneath the strict moral order of the medieval world, where the church defined right and wrong in every corner of human existence, there lived those whose desires did not fit the mold. They were men who loved men, women who loved women, and others who felt drawn beyond the boundaries the church allowed. Their stories were rarely written, their voices seldom preserved, but they were there, in monasteries and marketplaces, in royal courts and peasant cottages. They lived in secrecy and fear, sometimes in quiet understanding, sometimes in open defiance. The Middle Ages may have been a time of faith and judgment, but it was also quietly a time of hidden lives. The church's stance on same-sex desire was severe and absolute. It was called sodomy, a word that carried both sin and shame, and it was condemned as one of the gravest moral failings. Theologians warned that such acts defied nature and invited divine punishment, citing the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah as proof. Laws across Europe reflected this teaching, making homosexual acts punishable by fines, imprisonment, or even death. Yet, despite these harsh decrees, such relationships continued, hidden beneath layers of friendship, poetry, and prayer. Among men, the line between companionship and love was often blurred. Medieval society allowed deep, affectionate friendships between men, and such bonds were praised in literature and life. Knights swore oaths of loyalty to one another, shared beds for warmth on journeys, and wrote letters filled with language that modern readers might easily mistake for romance. Within monasteries, too, the closeness between brothers could become something more. The same walls that were meant to keep temptation out sometimes kept it in. Confessional records and disciplinary notes from abbeys reveal repeated admonitions against improper familiarity between monks, a phrase that hinted at more than brotherly affection. For women, same-sex relationships were both less visible and less prosecuted, but no less real. The cloistered life of convents created spaces where emotional intimacy could flourish. Nuns lived together for years, sharing not only work and prayer, but also the deep bonds that came from isolation and devotion. Some of their letters speak of affection that goes beyond spiritual sisterhood, longing, devotion, and even physical closeness. Because female desire was less understood and less feared, these relationships were often ignored or dismissed as harmless. Yet for the women who lived them, they were real, powerful, and sustaining in a world that allowed few other freedoms. The fear of homosexuality in medieval Europe was rooted as much in control as in faith. The Church's teachings sought to maintain order. Every person, every role, every act had its place. To desire outside of marriage, and especially outside the possibility of reproduction, was to threaten that order. The idea that love could exist without creating life was deeply unsettling to a culture obsessed with inheritance, lineage, and divine design. Thus, same-sex love was painted not only as sinful, but as unnatural, a rebellion against both God and society. Yet for those who felt it, it was simply love, tender, confusing, and undeniable. Some of the most fascinating glimpses of these hidden lives come from literature. The troubadours of southern France, who sang of impossible love, sometimes hinted at affection that crossed conventional boundaries. Certain poems, written in coded language, seemed to speak of same-sex devotion disguised as friendship. In the courts of Italy and England, too, letters between noblemen occasionally carried undertones of romantic longing. Even among clergy, passionate attachments were recorded, sometimes celebrated as spiritual love, sometimes condemned as corruption. The truth was often hidden in plain sight, cloaked in words that could mean one thing to the heart and another to the church. When discovered, such love could be met with brutal punishment. In some cities, men accused of sodomy were publicly executed, their deaths intended as moral warnings. In others, they were humiliated, exiled, or forced to repent through painful rituals. Yet despite the danger, the same acts continued, generation after generation. The records of persecution reveal not only the cruelty of law, but the persistence of love. For every accusation, there must have been countless others who lived quietly, loving in secret, never caught or confessed. The contradiction of medieval life was that same-sex affection was everywhere, even as it was denied. Knights shared oaths deeper than marriage. Monks embraced one another in prayer. Women wrote of love that sounded divine, but felt human. The Church itself, while condemning such acts, also preserved them in its own records, confessions, trials, letters, as if unable to stop documenting the very thing it sought to erase. It was both obsessed and horrified, fascinated and fearful, unable to reconcile the humanity it condemned. Some thinkers, however, began to see desire differently. Mystics wrote of divine love that transcended gender, where souls united beyond the flesh. The idea that love itself could be holy, regardless of its form, flickered faintly in the background of religious thought. It never became doctrine, but it remained in poetry, in prayer, in the quiet spaces where human hearts refused to obey rules they did not choose. In the end, the story of homosexuality in medieval times is not one of absence, but of invisibility. It existed everywhere and nowhere, whispered, hidden, condemned, but never destroyed. The people who lived those lives were forced to become shadows, but their feelings were as vivid and real as any other. They loved and lost, feared and hoped, prayed and sinned in the same breath as all others. Their names may be forgotten, but their existence lingers between the lines of history, reminding us that desire, in every form, has always found a way to endure, even in the darkest corners of faith and fear. By the time the Inquisition spread across medieval Europe, the Church had perfected the art of investigating not only faith but thought, not only heresy but desire. What had begun as a campaign to root out false doctrine soon reached into the private lives of ordinary people, turning even the most personal matters into potential evidence of sin. The Inquisition was not just a tribunal of belief. It was a system of control that sought to police the boundaries of the mind, the soul, and the body. And among its most secret concerns was the world of intimacy, how people loved, touched, and confessed. The Inquisition emerged in the 13th century, originally to combat heresy in southern France, but its reach grew quickly. Heretics were not only those who denied God, they were those who questioned the Church as authority, those who lived differently, and those whose private acts seemed to defy divine law. Under this vast net, lust became more than personal sin. It became evidence of rebellion against order. The same desire that might once have been whispered in confession could now become a charge of heresy, punishable by imprisonment or death. Fear seeped into every corner of life, and even love could be cause for suspicion. Intimacy itself became a potential crime when linked to forbidden belief. The Inquisition often associated sexual immorality with spiritual corruption. Heretical sects, such as the Cathars and the Free Spirits, were accused not only of denying church doctrine, but of engaging in secret orgies, of practicing sinful freedom under the guise of holiness. In truth, many of these accusations were exaggerations or fabrications, designed to shock the faithful and justify persecution. But the connection between lust and heresy served its purpose well. By framing desire as rebellion, the Church could claim authority over every impulse of the flesh. Confession, once meant as a path to forgiveness, became a tool of surveillance. Inquisitors questioned not only beliefs, but thoughts and behaviors, pressing for details with relentless curiosity. A person's dreams, gestures, or friendships could be twisted into evidence. Accusations could arise from gossip, jealousy, or fear. A woman who lived alone, a man who showed kindness to outcasts, a healer who used herbs instead of prayers, all might find themselves under suspicion. Intimacy of any kind that fell outside the Church's definition of purity could be labeled unnatural, heretical, or demonic. Women bore the brunt of this scrutiny. The Inquisition's gaze fell most often upon those whose independence defied control: midwives, widows, herbalists, and mystics. Their knowledge of the body and its secrets was seen as dangerous. In their hands, herbs could heal or harm, love could be stirred or subdued, and that power frightened the authorities. A woman who helped another conceive or avoid pregnancy might be accused of using witchcraft. One who spoke openly about love or pleasure might be charged with tempting others to sin. Intimacy, for women, became a field mined with invisible dangers. Men, too, faced accusations when their desires strayed from accepted norms. Same-sex relationships, once hidden within monasteries or knightly bonds, now risked exposure under the Inquisition's expanding definitions of sin. To love outside of marriage was to risk ruin, but to love against the natural order was to risk the flames. The Inquisition's records tell of men tortured into confession, their supposed crimes described in lurid detail, more to horrify than to understand. The Church claimed to defend morality, yet it catalogued sin with obsessive precision, ensuring that even the most private acts became public spectacle. In this atmosphere of fear, intimacy retreated into secrecy. Husbands and wives spoke carefully even to each other, afraid that confession could turn into accusation. Friends avoided closeness that might be misread. The body, once seen as a vessel of divine creation, became a potential traitor capable of betraying its owner through rumor or temptation. And yet, even under this watchful eye, the same desires continued. The more the Inquisition tried to suppress human longing, the more persistent it became. Lovers met in the dark, mystics wrote of divine passion in code, and ordinary people learned to guard their hearts as they might guard their souls. The irony was cruel. The Inquisition, in its effort to eliminate impurity, kept it alive in thought. The very act of searching for sin required imagining it, describing it, and documenting it in exhaustive detail. Manuals for inquisitors instructed them on the signs of lust and temptation, listing behaviors, gestures, and even dreams that might reveal guilt. It was as if the Church, in trying to destroy desire, could not stop thinking about it. The inquisitors' questions became confessions of their own fascination. Not all those accused were victims of lust. Some used the charge of lust to their advantage. A noble might accuse a rival of heresy to seize land, or a jealous husband might denounce his wife to rid himself of her. The language of sin became a weapon, and intimacy, the most personal of all human experiences, became a battlefield. Love, once a private act of connection, turned into something that could be judged, punished, and destroyed by power. Still, there were those who resisted quietly. Some priests offered forgiveness rather than condemnation, listening with compassion to those who confessed forbidden desires. Some communities protected their own, hiding accused women or refusing to testify. and some simply lived as they wished, in defiance of fear, trusting that their humanity was not the same as heresy. In the quiet of their homes, behind closed shutters, they made their own small acts of rebellion, not with words or war, but with tenderness. The Inquisition may have claimed to purify souls, but in truth it exposed them. It laid bare the fragility of faith and the persistence of desire. It showed that no law, no sermon, could truly separate the body from the spirit. The human need for love, touch, and connection survived torture, imprisonment, and fire. In a world ruled by suspicion, intimacy itself became an act of courage, proof that even under the threat of damnation, the heart refused to be silent. Far from the castles, monasteries, and courts, in the muddy fields and thatched cottages of medieval Europe, ordinary people lived lives of quiet endurance. Their days were filled with work, hunger, weather, and faith. Yet even among the poorest and most forgotten, the same desires stirred, the longing for warmth, for love, for touch. While the church and nobility argued over doctrine and purity, peasants lived their passions in the margins, guided more by survival than by sin. Their love stories were seldom written down, but they were as real as tangled, and as human as any royal scandal or saint's temptation. For peasants, marriage was rarely about romance. It was about partnership, two people joining their strength to till the soil, raise children, and face the hardships of life. The church blessed these unions, but for most peasants, the ceremony was a formality. What mattered was the work to be done and the mouths to feed. Yet, even in a world ruled by necessity, affection found its place. Couples shared laughter in the fields, whispered to one another under the stars, and found comfort in each other's arms after long days. Their love, though simple, was sincere and often stronger than the rules that sought to contain it. The Church's teachings about lust and purity reached even the smallest villages. Priests preached against fornication, warning that a single night of passion could doom a soul. But confession was rare among peasants, and guilt, though present, was often practical rather than spiritual. They understood sin, but they also understood hunger, loneliness, and the briefness of life. When famine or plague could strike at any time, the threat of damnation sometimes felt far away. Love and desire were not abstract ideas to them. They were small comforts, sparks of warmth in a cold and uncertain world. Courtship among peasants was unrefined, but full of spirit. Festivals, fairs, and feast days provided rare chances for mingling. Young men and women met while dancing around maypoles or sharing cider after the harvest. These moments, filled with laughter and song, were some of the few times when work and duty fell away, replaced by the simple joy of being alive. Flirtation was open, bold, and often physical. A stolen kiss behind a barn, a shared walk through the woods, these were the beginnings of many rural romances. The church disapproved, of course, but even priests knew better than to think they could stop it entirely. Still, moral boundaries existed. A woman's reputation was fragile, and a man's word carried weight. An unmarried woman who became pregnant risked shame and hardship, though many communities were more forgiving than the church would have been. Bastards were common, and while priests condemned them, most villagers accepted them as part of life. Marriage, when it came, was often hurried by necessity, a promise made at the edge of scandal. Yet within these imperfect arrangements, genuine bonds formed. Many peasant marriages were loving, even tender, built not on ideals of purity, but on the shared struggle of survival. Desire among peasants was rarely hidden, but it was rarely spoken of directly. Their songs and stories carried its echoes, bawdy ballads sung after ale had loosened tongues, jokes traded at the fire's edge, tales that mixed humor with longing. These were the unfiltered expressions of human nature, far removed from the solemn teachings of monks and theologians. Lust was not a philosophical problem to them. It was simply part of being alive. The earth itself seemed to echo it, planting and harvest, birth and death, the turning of seasons. The rhythms of their bodies mirrored the rhythms of the land. There were, of course, darker sides to this earthy passion. Poverty and desperation often blurred lines of consent, and women bore the heaviest consequences. The church punished fornication and adultery, but those with power, the local lords, priests, or landowners, were rarely held to account. Many took advantage of peasant women, offering protection or food in exchange for silence. These injustices were whispered about, but rarely challenged. Life was too fragile, and justice too distant. Yet even amid exploitation and hardship, love still bloomed, sometimes as rebellion, sometimes as refuge, always as proof of endurance. Festivals dedicated to fertility and spring, long condemned by the church as pagan remnants, survived among the common folk. On May Day and Midsummer nights, bonfires were lit, songs were sung, and people danced deep into the dark. Old customs blurred with new faith, and desire took on a sacred quality, not sinful, but natural, part of the cycle that kept life turning. For a brief moment each year, peasants forgot their burdens and let the world feel wide and bright again. The church scowled, but the celebrations continued, generation after generation. Love among peasants was not written in poetry or recorded in chronicles, but it lived in gestures, in the way a man brought home wildflowers, or a woman mended her husband's coat with care, or two lovers shared a piece of bread beneath the same roof. It was not the love of saints or kings, but it was honest, rough-edged, and enduring. It was love born from work and worry, sustained by laughter and need. It was, in many ways, the truest form of passion the medieval world ever knew. In the end, the peasant's passion was both humble and profound. It was free from the heavy moral chains of the church, though never completely untouched by them. It existed in defiance of hardship, in the cracks between sermons and seasons. It was the kind of love that needed no permission, the kind that kept humanity alive through centuries of fear, hunger, and faith. While the powerful hid their sins behind confessions and gold, the poor carried theirs openly, quietly, and without shame. In their simple, stubborn way, they reminded the world that even in its darkest age, love still found light. As the Middle Ages drew to a close, and the first light of the Renaissance began to rise over Europe, something profound began to shift. After centuries of fear and repression, the human spirit, and with it, the understanding of love and desire, began to awaken. The rigid walls built by the medieval church, walls that divided body from soul and passion from purity, began to crack. Art, science, and philosophy rediscovered the value of the human form, the beauty of emotion, and the legitimacy of pleasure. Desire, once branded as sin, started to be seen again as part of what made life worth living. The rebirth of Europe was, in many ways, also a rebirth of the human heart. This transformation did not happen overnight. It began quietly, in the writings of poets, in the paintings of artists, in the whispered defiance of thinkers who dared to question the old order. In Italy, the poet Petrarch wrote sonnets, not to saints, but to a woman, Lara, whose beauty stirred his soul and sharpened his pen. His verses were filled with longing, not guilt. He loved her from afar, as the troubadours had once done, but he did not write of sin. He wrote of admiration, of humanity, of how love could elevate rather than destroy. This was something new, the idea that desire could lead not to damnation, but to enlightenment. In Florence, artists like Botticelli and Leonardo da Vinci painted the human body not as a vessel of temptation, but as a masterpiece of divine creation. Their subjects were mythological, sensual, alive. The goddess Venus returned to canvas and sculpture, rising from the sea not as a symbol of shame, but of beauty itself. Her presence marked a turning point, a declaration that the body was no longer the enemy of the soul. In her curves and calm, in her soft gaze, the world began to see that holiness and humanity could exist together. The flesh, long condemned, was reborn as art. Philosophers, too, began to reinterpret the nature of love. Thinkers like Marsilio Ficino and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola studied ancient Greek writings that had been lost to Europe for centuries. From Plato's dialogues, they rediscovered the idea of divine love, eros as a bridge between human and divine, physical desire as a reflection of spiritual longing. Ficino wrote that through love, one could glimpse the perfection of the divine mind. This was radical in a world that had long feared the body's power. It was an attempt to reconcile flesh and faith, to see the two not as enemies, but as companions. Even within the church, there were voices calling for change. Mystics and reformers began to question the suffocating weight of guilt that had been placed upon ordinary people. They argued that God's creation, including the human body, was not something to be ashamed of. The great cathedrals that once echoed with sermons against lust now housed paintings and sculptures that celebrated beauty in every form. The same hands that once carved crucifixes now shaped marble bodies that looked alive with breath. It was as if Europe itself had remembered that to be human was not to be fallen, but to be alive. This new vision of love did not erase the old fears entirely. The church still preached against sin, and scandal still carried its dangers. But there was a growing sense that desire could be guided, not just punished. Courtly love evolved into romance, and romance into the language of literature and music. Love stories that had once ended in tragedy began to find gentler resolutions. The lovers of medieval tales, once punished for their passion, were reborn in Renaissance art as symbols of harmony. Man and woman, thought and feeling, flesh and soul, joined rather than divided. For women, too, this era opened slow but significant change. Though still constrained by law and expectation, women began to find their voices in poetry, art, and letters. Writers like Christine de Pizan defended women's virtue and intelligence, arguing that the old tales of Eve and temptation were distortions of truth. In her words, and in those of others who followed, woman was no longer just a vessel of sin or symbol of purity. She was human, complex, capable of desire and reason alike. Her heart, too, was allowed to exist without shame. The rebirth of desire was not only about love between people, it was about the rediscovery of joy itself. After centuries of plague, war, and fear, Europe began to dream again. Music grew livelier, laughter returned to the streets, and art celebrated not only saints and martyrs, but dancers, lovers, and ordinary life. Pleasure, once confined to whispers and shadows, began to step into the light. It was not perfect, and it was not entirely free, but it was a beginning, the start of a new way of seeing the self and the world. In this renewed vision, lust was no longer the eternal enemy of the soul. It was understood as part of the human experience. Dangerous, yes, but also beautiful, necessary, and deeply alive. The same fire that could burn could also illuminate, and the Renaissance embraced both. It did not deny sin, but it no longer denied the self. And so, desire returned to the center of life, in art, in words, in the simple act of seeing the world as something to be loved. The Middle Ages had taught people to fear their bodies. The Renaissance taught them to celebrate them again. And in that celebration, humanity rediscovered what it had always known, deep beneath the sermons and the shame, that love, in all its forms, is not the enemy of the divine, but its reflection. The rebirth of desire was the rebirth of humanity itself. And so, as the candles burn low and the echoes of the past fade into quiet, we reach the end of our journey through lust, sin, and salvation in the medieval world. What began as a story of repression and fear became something more, a reflection of humanity itself, caught between faith and flesh, guilt and grace. The people of the Middle Ages lived under the shadow of sin, yet within that shadow, they dreamed, desired, and loved with the same intensity we do today. Their confessions, their secrets, and their whispered passions remind us that no sermon, no punishment, and no rule could ever erase what it means to be human. We've seen how the church tried to command desire, turning it into doctrine and shame. We've walked through monasteries where temptation hid behind prayer, courts where love became politics, and villages where peasants loved simply because they could. We've seen pain turned into holiness, lust turned into art, and sin turned into salvation. Every story, whether whispered in the confessional or painted on a cathedral wall, tells the same truth, that desire has always been stronger than fear. It bends, hides, disguises itself, but it never disappears. It survives because it is life itself. The medieval world believed that lust was the path to damnation, but in their struggle against it, they revealed something divine, that passion and love are not the enemies of the soul, but the evidence of it. Even in the darkest centuries, when every touch carried the weight of sin, people still reached for one another, still searched for warmth in cold nights, still believed that love could heal what faith alone could not. The story of lust in the Middle Ages is not just a history of rules broken. It is a story of persistence, of the human heart refusing to be silenced. So as you close your eyes tonight, let these centuries of whispers fade into the quiet hum of sleep. Imagine the flicker of candlelight in an old stone chapel, the rustle of robes, the secret smiles, the endless struggle between holiness and hunger. Feel the peace that comes from knowing that those who came before us, saints and sinners alike, were never so different from us. They, too, were searching for meaning in the same small, beautiful ways, through love, through longing, through the simple act of being alive. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more quiet journeys through the forgotten corners of history, remember to subscribe to the channel. It helps this little world of sleepy storytelling grow and keeps these long-forgotten voices alive. Leave a comment below and tell us when you listen, in the deep hours of midnight, or as the dawn begins to rise, and let us know what tales you'd like to drift away to next. Thank you for joining me tonight. Until our next story, rest easy, dream softly, and remember, even in the strictest of times, love always found a way.